At its peak, Consumers Distributing ran 460 stores across North America. Not Sears, not Woolworths, not Kmart, Consumers Distributing. A catalog store most Americans have never heard of, and every Canadian over 50 remembers like it was yesterday. Twice a year, a thick catalog arrived in the mailbox. Families sat around the kitchen table and flipped through it page by page, circling items with pencil, dog-earing corners, memorizing product numbers. Then they drove to the store, filled out a paper order form, handed it to a clerk, and waited while someone in the back warehouse went to find the item. Sometimes the item arrived. Sometimes it didn't. By 1996, after nearly 4 decades, every single store was gone. Not swallowed by Amazon, not killed by the internet. Consumers Distributing collapsed before any of that existed. How does a company that invented the future of shopping fail to survive long enough to see that future arrive? This is the story of an idea that was 40 years ahead of its time, and a business that couldn't hold itself together long enough to prove it. Jack Stupp was not a businessman, not in the way that word usually gets used. He did not come from money. He did not have a business degree hanging on a wall somewhere. In the mid-1950s, Jack Stupp was a door-to-door salesman in Toronto, the kind of man who knocked on strangers' doors in the cold, carried a sample case, and survived entirely on his ability to read people. He knew what they wanted before they said it. He knew what they could afford before they pulled out their wallet. And what he saw going door to door across Toronto in those years was something simple and persistent. Working people wanted good things, nice things, a new toaster, a decent watch, a camera for the kids' birthdays. They wanted exactly what the department stores downtown were selling. They just couldn't justify paying department store prices. The problem, as Stupp saw it, wasn't desire. It was overhead. Every dollar a retailer spent on polished floors, fancy lighting, trained salespeople walking the floor in pressed suits, every one of those dollars eventually landed on the price tag. The customer paid for the showroom whether they wanted to or not. Stupp believed there had to be a better way. In 1957, he found it. Together with his partner, Sidney Druckmann, Stupp opened the first Consumers Distributing store in Toronto. The concept was unlike anything North America had seen. There were no shelves piled with merchandise, no salespeople walking the floor. Instead, there were glass display cabinets showing samples of the products: jewelry, appliances, kitchenware, small electronics, and stacks of thick catalogs on the counters for customers to browse. When a customer decided what they wanted, they didn't grab it off a shelf. They wrote it down. A product number on a small paper form handed to a clerk at the counter. The clerk disappeared through a door into the back warehouse, found the item in inventory, and brought it out. The whole operation ran like a library, except instead of books, people were checking out blenders and watches and transistor radios. It was efficient in a way that felt almost radical. No expensive floor displays to maintain. No sprawling showroom eating up square footage. The warehouse did the work. The catalog did the selling. And the savings passed through to the customer in the form of prices that the downtown department stores simply could not match. The first customers who walked through that Toronto door in 1957 were not wealthy shoppers looking for luxury. They were factory workers and office clerks and young families just starting out. People who had been doing the math in their heads for years, who knew exactly what something should cost if someone wasn't marking it up to pay for chandeliers and carpet. Stupp gave those people something they hadn't had before, a store that was on their side. The catalog itself was part of the experience from day one. It wasn't just a sales tool. It was something people took home. They read it at the kitchen table. They showed it to their neighbors. They came back to it a week later when they'd saved enough. For a generation of Canadians who grew up without a lot of disposable income, that catalog represented something larger than any single product inside it. It represented the idea that the right thing at the right price was actually within reach. Jack Stupp built that feeling into the foundation of his company. It was the truest thing about Consumers Distributing, and it would carry the chain further than anyone in 1957 could have imagined. But the same model that made Consumers Distributing possible would, decades later, become the very thing it couldn't escape. There is a particular kind of memory that does not fade. Not the memory of a place exactly, not the address, not the parking lot, not the fluorescent lights overhead, but the feeling of being inside that place, the specific weight of a catalog in both hands, the sound of pages turning, the quiet concentration of a child who has found the toy section and is not moving until every single item has been considered. For millions of Canadians who grew up in the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s, that memory belongs to consumers distributing. Twice a year, spring and fall, the new catalog arrived. It came in the mail like a small event. It was thick and glossy and smelled like fresh ink. And the moment it landed on the kitchen table, everything else stopped. Kids claimed it first. They flipped past the appliances, past the kitchenware, past the jewelry section their mothers lingered over, and went straight to the back, to the toys, the electronics, the things that felt like the future. Slot car sets, transistor radios, later video game cartridges and personal calculators that cost more than a week's groceries. The catalog was not just advertising, it was a document of what was possible. Families used it the way people use wish lists today, except there was no algorithm, no targeted ad, no one watching what they clicked, just a printed page and a pencil and the private act of deciding what mattered. Mothers circled items for Christmas. Fathers checked prices on power tools. Teenagers memorized product numbers for things they were saving up to buy themselves. And when the time came to actually buy, the trip to consumers distributing was its own kind of ritual. The stores were not large by department store standards. The layout was simple: long glass display cases running in rows, showing samples of what was available. A blender behind glass, a watch on a velvet stand, a camera beside its case. Customers moved along the counters, catalog in hand, comparing what they saw in print to what sat behind the glass. When they had made up their minds, they picked up a small paper order form from one of the stacks on the counter and wrote down the product number. That slip of paper, handed to a clerk, was the moment the transaction became real. The clerk would take the form, disappear through a door in the back wall, and somewhere behind that door, in a warehouse the customer never saw, someone was walking the shelves to find exactly what had been requested. There was a pause, a wait, and then the item appeared, boxed or wrapped, carried out from the back and set on the counter. It felt, in a way that is hard to explain now, like a small kind of magic. Patricia Varga, who grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, remembered shopping at Consumers Distributing with her mother in the early 1970s. Her mother had been saving for months to buy a new electric mixer, had cut the page from the catalog and kept it folded in her purse. The day they finally went to the store, Patricia was allowed to hold the order form and hand it to the clerk herself. When the box came out from the back, her mother checked the model number twice before she would let herself smile. That mixer stayed in the family for over 20 years. Stories like that one were not unusual. Consumers Distributing existed at exactly the right moment for a generation of working Canadians who were building their households piece by piece, on budgets that left little room for error. The store's promise: lowest prices, honest goods, no salespeople breathing down your neck, was not a marketing slogan. It was the actual experience, and customers recognized it as genuine. By the late 1970s, the chain had expanded well beyond Toronto. Stores had opened across Ontario, then into Quebec, then westward into the prairie provinces. The catalog went with them, arriving in mailboxes from Halifax to Vancouver. In a country as geographically spread out as Canada, that catalog created something rare: a shared retail experience that crossed provincial lines. A family in Winnipeg was looking at the same pages as a family in St. John, New Brunswick. They were circling the same items, comparing the same prices, planning the same trips to the store. There was a sense during those years that Consumers Distributing understood something the bigger department stores did not. It did not try to impress its customers. It did not dress itself up with escalators and perfume counters and restaurants on the top floor. It asked only one thing of the people who walked through its doors: know what you want, write it down, and we will get it for you. For a long time, that was enough. What was it about that simple transaction, a paper form, a short wait, a box carried out from the back, that felt so satisfying to so many people for so many years? The answer, in part, is that it put the customer in control. In a world where retail was increasingly about spectacle and pressure and the slow erosion of a shopper's willpower, consumers distributing offered something quieter. A person came in having already decided. The decision had been made at home, at the kitchen table in private. The store was simply where the decision got fulfilled. That feeling of being prepared, of knowing exactly what you came for, of walking out with the thing you had chosen, was the real product consumers distributing was selling. And through the late 1970s and into the mid-1980s, business had never been better. In 1988, the chain's annual revenues crossed $1 billion. 460 stores were operating across Canada and the United States. The catalog was in homes from Newfoundland to Nevada. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should. But inside the company, something had already begun to shift. Something small enough that most customers would not notice it for years. A frustration, building quietly, a gap between what the catalog promised and what the warehouse could actually deliver. The first sign of it was a steel bulletin board on the wall near the front counter, a thing called the flashboard. By the time the 1970s arrived, consumers distributing had outgrown Toronto, not just physically, although the stores were multiplying fast across Ontario, but in terms of what the company believed it could become. Jack Stupp had built something that worked. The catalog model was proven, the customers were loyal, the prices were competitive in a way that traditional department stores could not easily match. The question was no longer whether the concept was valid. The question was how far it could go. The answer came in 1969 when the company went public on the Toronto Stock Exchange. That single decision changed the nature of everything that followed. Access to capital meant access to speed. And consumers distributing moved fast. The Oshawa Group, one of Canada's largest grocery and retail conglomerates, acquired a 50% stake in the company shortly after the public offering. The partnership gave consumers distributing the financial backing to expand beyond Ontario at a pace that would have been impossible on its own. New stores opened in Quebec, where the chain operated under the name Distribution au Consommateur, then into the Maritime provinces, then westward, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia. By the late 1970s, consumers distributing had stores in every single Canadian province. 10 provinces, every one of them. That kind of national reach was not something most Canadian retailers ever achieved. Eaton's had it. Sears Canada had it. And now quietly, so did a catalog showroom that had started with a door-to-door salesman in a single storefront in Toronto. But Canada was only part of the ambition. In the early 1980s, consumers distributing made its move into the United States. The American market was enormous, and the catalog showroom concept was not entirely foreign there. Chains like Service Merchandise and Best Products had been operating a similar model in the States for years. Consumers distributing did not build its American presence from scratch. Instead, it acquired. The company purchased a 70-store American chain, also called Consumers, from the May Department Stores Company, and picked up an additional 42 locations through the Cardinal Distributors catalog chain from Steinberg Inc. In a matter of months, the company had added over 100 American stores to its network. By 1981, Consumers Distributing was operating approximately 400 locations across North America. The American stores ran out of a corporate headquarters in Edison, New Jersey. They carried the same product categories as the Canadian locations: jewelry, appliances, small electronics, kitchenware, toys, personal care items, and operated on the same warehouse fulfillment model. Customers in New Hampshire and Connecticut and New Jersey were filling out the same paper order forms that customers in Hamilton and Saskatoon had been filling out for 20 years. In 1978, the Oshawa Group sold its 50% stake back, leaving Consumers Distributing fully independent once again. The timing was deliberate. The company was strong enough to stand on its own, and the American expansion was already underway. The separation was clean. The momentum was undeniable. And then came Toy City. In the early 1980s, Consumers Distributing launched a separate chain of toy stores under the Toy City name, Toyville in Quebec. It was a natural extension of what the company already knew. Toys had always been one of the strongest catalog categories. Parents trusted the prices. Kids trusted the selection. Toy City gave the company a dedicated retail presence in a product category where emotional attachment and seasonal spending ran extremely high. At its peak, the combination of consumers distributing stores and Toy City locations represented one of the largest non-food retail footprints in Canadian history. The people running the expansion in those years believed they were building something permanent, and from the outside, the evidence supported that belief. The stores were busy, the catalogs were reaching millions of households, revenues were climbing toward that billion-dollar threshold. Competitors had tried to replicate the model. Hudson's Bay Company had launched a catalog showroom chain called ShopRite in direct competition, expanding to 65 Ontario locations, and failed. ShopRite never turned a profit and closed entirely in 1982. The failure of a well-funded competitor attempting the exact same model felt to consumers distributing's leadership like confirmation. The market had spoken. There was room for one catalog showroom chain in Canada, and consumers distributing was it. What that confidence obscured was a structural problem that had been present since the very first store opened in 1957, and that no amount of expansion could fix. The model depended entirely on one promise, that when a customer handed over a paper form, the item on that form would be in the back warehouse waiting for them. For years, the company had managed to keep that promise often enough that the exceptions felt like inconveniences rather than patterns. But as the store count grew, as locations multiplied from dozens to hundreds, spread across 10 provinces and 9 American states, the gap between what the catalog advertised and what the warehouses actually held began to widen. It was not a dramatic gap, not yet. It showed up in small ways. A customer who drove 20 minutes to pick up a watch, only to be told it was out of stock. A family that had planned a birthday purchase around a specific item in the fall catalog, only to find the number wasn't available at their location. Small frustrations, easily forgiven the first time. But the first time has a way of becoming the second time, and the second time has a way of becoming a reputation. The company was about to find out just how hard a reputation is to shake, and how much damage a steel bulletin board with a few magnetic numbers on it could do to 40 years of customer trust. In 1988, consumers distributing crossed $1 billion in annual revenue. That number mattered, not as a financial milestone, but as a measure of reach. $1 billion meant that somewhere across Canada and the northeastern United States, an extraordinary number of ordinary families had walked through those doors that year, filled out those forms, and carried home what they came for. It meant the catalog was sitting on kitchen tables from Newfoundland to Nevada. It meant the company had moved in 31 years from a single storefront in Toronto to something that looked, by every visible measure, like an institution. And institutions, by definition, are things people stop questioning. At the height of its power, consumers distributing was woven into the fabric of Canadian family life in a way that went far beyond shopping. It was present at the moments that mattered. The Christmas morning when the toy from the fall catalog finally appeared under the tree, the one the child had circled in pencil 3 months earlier and quietly hoped for ever since. The birthday present bought on a careful budget, chosen from a dog-eared page, carried home in a plain brown box. The small kitchen appliance that a young couple put on their list when they were furnishing their first apartment together. These were not grand gestures. They were the accumulation of ordinary life. And consumers distributing was there for all of them. The catalog itself had become something more than a retail publication. Families kept back issues. Children cut out pictures of things they wanted and taped them to their bedroom walls. The arrival of a new edition, spring or fall, was treated in some households with the same low-grade excitement as a holiday. There was a ritual to it. The catalog claimed first, flipped through in a specific order, the important pages marked. A quiet, private negotiation between what a family wanted and what it could afford. For the employees who staffed the stores during those peak years, there was a particular pride in being part of something that people genuinely relied on. The clerks behind the counters knew their regular customers. They recognized faces. They remembered that a certain woman always came in on Fridays, always asked about the jewelry case on the left, always took her time. The warehouse staff in the back, The men and women who spent their shifts walking the shelves, pulling orders, carrying boxes to the counter, worked in a space the customers never saw, but they understood that the whole operation depended on them getting it right. When they did, the transaction had a completeness to it that was hard to articulate, but easy to feel. A customer came in knowing exactly what they wanted. They wrote it down. Someone went and got it. The item appeared. Money changed hands. Everyone went home satisfied. That sequence, simple, repeatable, honest, was the engine of everything Consumers Distributing had built. The chain's cultural footprint extended beyond its stores in ways the company never fully understood or took credit for. In communities across Canada, a Consumers Distributing store was not just a place to shop. It was a local employer, often one of the more stable ones in a given neighborhood. It was a familiar landmark, a place people passed on their way to somewhere else and felt a small unconscious comfort in seeing. The lit sign in the window, the familiar logo, the knowledge that if something was needed, the option was there. Canadian television commercials for the chain during the late 1970s and 1980s leaned hard into that reliability. The message was consistent. No pressure, no games, just the things you need at the prices you deserve. It was advertising that spoke directly to the sensibility of its audience. People who had grown up being careful with money and who responded to straightforwardness the way others responded to luxury. Generationally, the chain passed itself down. Grandparents who had shopped there in the 1960s brought their adult children in the 1980s. Parents who had grown up circling items in the catalog were now handing those catalogs to their own kids. There was a continuity to it, a sense that Consumers Distributing was simply part of how Canadian families manage their lives. The same way certain kitchen brands or hardware stores become permanent fixtures in a household's geography. By the mid-1980s, at 460 stores across 10 Canadian provinces and 9 American states, the chain had achieved something that most retailers spend their entire existence chasing. It had made itself feel necessary. That feeling of necessity, of permanence, of being too embedded in daily life to ever simply disappear is one of the most dangerous things a company can believe about itself. Because necessity, it turns out, is not a fixed condition. It is something customers grant and customers can take back. Not all at once, and not with any announcement. Just gradually, trip by trip, each small disappointment adding its weight to a quiet, accumulating decision. The decision that there might be somewhere better to go. That decision was already being made in small numbers, by small clusters of customers in locations across the network. They had gone to the store, they had filled out the form, they had waited at the counter, and they had been told, again, that the item they wanted was not in stock. It had happened before, they had forgiven it before. This time, some of them did not come back. It started with a bulletin board. In 1984, Consumers Distributing introduced something called the flashboard. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. A steel board mounted near the front of the store, covered in magnetic tiles, each tile stamped with a product number from the current catalog. When an item was out of stock, its number went up on the board. Customers could check it before filling out their order form and save themselves the wait. The intention was good, the execution was logical, and the effect was quietly catastrophic. Because the flashboard did not solve the out-of-stock problem. It announced it. Every customer who walked through the door and looked at that board, and they all looked eventually, was receiving the same silent message. Things are missing here. Come prepared to be disappointed. Before the flashboard, a customer who was told their item was unavailable might have chalked it up to bad luck, an off day, an unusual circumstance. After the flashboard, the same customer had visible, public confirmation that out of stock was not an exception at Consumers Distributing. It was a condition, it was managed, it had its own dedicated piece of furniture. The damage was not immediate. It rarely is with this kind of thing. But it was real, and it was accumulating in the minds of customers who had, until that point, been largely willing to absorb the occasional frustration. The out-of-stock problem itself was structural, woven into the design of the business from the beginning. The catalog model required the company to print its product offerings 6 months in advance. Twice a year, the new edition went to press, and whatever was in that edition was what the company was committed to selling for the next 6 months. Prices were locked in, product numbers were locked in. The catalog was a promise made in bulk, distributed to millions of households and honored, or not, one customer at a time. The problem was that the world did not hold still for 6 months. Costs changed. Supplier inventory shifted. A product that had been readily available when the catalog went to press might be difficult to source by the time the catalog reached customers' hands. And when the gap between what was printed and what was available grew too wide, the warehouse shelves showed it, and the flashboard reflected it. The company tried to adapt. Shorter supplemental catalogs were introduced between the main seasonal editions, allowing for faster updates to the product lineup. But the core problem remained. The model depended on the catalog, and the catalog depended on certainty. Certainty about supply, certainty about pricing, certainty about what customers would find when they showed up with their order forms. That certainty was becoming harder and harder to maintain. Meanwhile, the retail landscape around consumers distributing was shifting in ways that the company's leadership was slow to recognize as existential. Through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, the catalog showroom concept had been distinctive enough that consumers distributing had operated largely without serious, direct competition. ShopRite had tried and failed. The department stores, Eaton's, the Bay Zellers, competed on different terms with different customers and different price points. The playing field felt manageable. Then Walmart came to Canada. The first Walmart Canada stores opened in 1994, built on the bones of the Woolco chain that Walmart had acquired. They were enormous. They carried everything: appliances, electronics, housewares, toys, clothing, groceries, at prices that had been sharpened to a competitive edge through a supply chain and a purchasing operation of a scale that no Canadian retailer could match. And crucially, every item was on the shelf, visible, touchable, available to take home right now without a form or a wait or the possibility of being turned away empty-handed. Zellers, which had been strengthening its own discount retail position through the late 1980s and early 1990s, was pushing in the same direction. The message from both competitors was the same, even if it was never stated directly. Why write down a number and hope for the best when you can simply reach out and take what you came for? That question, hanging unspoken in the air of every Walmart and Zellers that opened near a consumer's distributing location, was the most dangerous thing the company had ever faced. How long could a business built on trust, on the promise that the catalog's word was good, survive once customers had a reliable alternative just down the road? Inside the company, the people who understood retail could see what was happening. The customer complaint numbers were rising. Repeat visits were softening in markets where big box competition had arrived. The flashboard, intended to manage expectations, had become a symbol that competitors could point to without ever pointing at it, just by being the kind of store where no flashboard was necessary. But the response from senior leadership was not urgency. It was optimization. New inventory systems were discussed. Store formats were reconsidered. The superstore concept, larger locations where in-stock items were displayed directly on the floor, visible and accessible, was proposed as a way to modernize the experience. These were not bad ideas. Some of them were genuinely forward-thinking. They were also expensive, and they were being considered by a company that, beneath its billion-dollar revenue figure, was carrying more financial pressure than its public face suggested. Because in 1987, something had happened that most customers never knew about. A change in ownership that would alter the direction of consumers distributing more profoundly than any bulletin board or inventory system ever could. The company had been sold. In 1987, Consumers Distributing was sold to Provigo. For anyone unfamiliar with Canadian retail history, that name requires a moment of context. Provigo was a Quebec-based grocery conglomerate, a supermarket company. It operated food stores. It understood produce and dairy and shelf-stable goods and the logistics of getting perishable items from a distribution center to a checkout line. It did not, in any meaningful operational sense, understand catalog retail. It did not understand the specific rhythm of a business built around a printed publication, a warehouse fulfillment system, and a customer base whose loyalty was contingent on a single, fragile promise that the item on the form would be there when the clerk went to find it. Provigo bought Consumers Distributing because the numbers looked attractive. A billion-dollar revenue chain with national reach and brand recognition in every Canadian province was, on paper, a compelling acquisition. The catalog model was unfamiliar, but unfamiliar was not the same as unknowable. The assumption was that professional retail management could learn whatever it needed to learn. That assumption would prove costly. The 6 years of Provigo ownership, 1987 to 1993, were years in which the structural problems that had been building inside Consumers Distributing were neither fully understood nor effectively addressed. The out-of-stock issue continued. The competitive pressure from big box retail continued to grow. The Toy City chain, which had seemed like a natural extension of the catalog model in the early 1980s, was struggling to find its footing as dedicated toy retailers and mass merchandisers carved up the market. Internally, the sense of direction that Jack Stupp had brought to the company, the clarity of purpose that came from a founder who had built the thing from nothing and understood every part of it, was gone. In 1993, Provigo sold Consumers Distributing again. The buyer was Ackermans and Van Haren, a Belgian holding company, a European financial group with no background in North American retail, no existing infrastructure on the continent, and no particular expertise in the catalog showroom model, now owned one of Canada's most recognizable retail chains. The people who worked in the stores, the clerks behind the glass counters, the warehouse staff pulling orders in the back, the regional managers overseeing clusters of locations across multiple provinces. Watch this change of ownership the way employees always watch such things, with a mixture of uncertainty and resignation. They had survived one ownership change. They would adapt to another. The work was the same regardless of who owned the company. Customers still came in. Forms still got filled out. Boxes still came out from the back. But the decisions being made at the top were now being made by people who were, in the most literal sense, very far away. Under Ackermans and Van Haren, the company moved forward with a set of initiatives that had been under discussion for years. Initiatives that were individually reasonable and collectively ruinous. The first was the superstore expansion. Larger format locations, where in-stock merchandise was displayed directly on the floor rather than locked behind glass cases, were meant to address the out-of-stock perception problem directly. If customers could see the product with their own eyes, could reach out and confirm it was there, the anxiety of the order form process would be reduced. The concept had genuine logic behind it, but superstore locations required significantly more floor space, which meant higher rents. They required more inventory on display, which meant higher carrying costs. And they required a level of visual merchandising sophistication that the company had never needed to develop. Because for 35 years, its stores had not been merchandised at all. They had been warehouses with a counter at the front. The second initiative was free home delivery, offered as a remedy for the cases where an item was out of stock at a customer's local store, but available at another location or at the main warehouse. The intention was to remove the sting of the flashboard, to say in effect that even if the item wasn't here today, it would arrive at the customer's door without additional cost. It was a generous policy. It was also an operational commitment that added expense to every transaction it touched, in a business that was already running on margins that had nowhere left to compress. The third initiative was the most ambitious and the most expensive. Consumers Distributing invested in a state-of-the-art real-time inventory management system, technology that allowed any store in the network to check the stock levels of any other store or of the central warehouse at the moment a customer was standing at the counter. It was, by the standards of early 1990s retail technology, genuinely advanced. The system could suggest alternative products when a requested item was unavailable. It could initiate store-to-store transfers. It could, in theory, make the flashboard obsolete. In practice, it added another layer of cost to a company that was spending money it did not have on problems it had waited too long to solve. And who exactly was supposed to protect the people on the front lines? The employees and the customers who had built their routines around this company while the boardroom cycled through ownership changes and expensive experiments? The answer, it turned out, was no one. Because while the superstores were being built and the delivery policy was being rolled out and the inventory software was being installed, the underlying reality of the business was not improving. Customers in markets where Walmart had arrived were not coming back after their first visit to a competitor with fully stocked shelves and no order forms. The Toy City locations, already weakened, began closing in the early 1990s. Quietly, without announcement, the stores shuttering one by one until the chain that had once represented Consumers Distributing's boldest expansion was simply gone. The irony at the center of all of it was almost too precise to believe. Consumers Distributing had been described, even in its own time, as internet shopping before the internet. The model, browse a catalog at home, submit an order, wait for fulfillment, was structurally identical to what Amazon would build and perfect a decade later. The difference was that Amazon solved the fulfillment problem. Amazon made the promise of the catalog absolute. If it was listed, it was available, and it would arrive. Consumers Distributing never solved that problem. It managed it, worked around it, apologized for it, and eventually spent itself into insolvency trying to paper over it. By 1995, the financial picture inside the company was beyond repair. The superstore build-out had consumed capital that was gone. The free delivery program was hemorrhaging money on every transaction it fulfilled. The new inventory system, for all its technical sophistication, had not rebuilt the customer trust that years of out-of-stock experiences had eroded. Revenues were falling. Costs were not. The end was not coming. The end had already arrived. It was just waiting for someone to make it official. The announcement came in 1996. There was no single dramatic moment, no press conference, no scandal, no catastrophic event that the news could point to as the cause. Consumers Distributing filed for bankruptcy protection in the spring of 1996, and the filing read the way such documents always read: dry, procedural, a list of liabilities exceeding assets, a request for time and protection while options were explored. The language was careful. The reality it described was not. The company was finished. For the people who worked inside the stores, the news arrived the way bad news usually arrives in large organizations: unevenly, incompletely, filtered through layers of management that were themselves uncertain about what came next. A regional manager called a store manager. A store manager gathered the staff before opening. Some locations heard through the news. Some employees found out the same way the customers did, by reading about it. Linda Marchetti had worked at a Consumers Distributing location in Scarborough, Ontario for 11 years by the time the closure was announced. She had started as a part-time clerk during high school, stayed through college, and eventually moved into a full-time supervisory role. She knew the store the way you only know a place when you have spent a decade of your life inside it. The specific sound the back warehouse door made when it swung open, the particular light in the afternoon when the sun came through the front windows at an angle, the regulars who came in every few weeks and whose preferences she had memorized without meaning to. When the closing was announced, she said later, the thing she felt first was not sadness, it was disbelief. Not because the company had been thriving, anyone paying attention knew it hadn't, but because some places feel too permanent to end. Consumers Distributing had been there her entire adult life. It had been there her entire childhood. The idea that it would simply stop existing required a kind of mental adjustment that took longer than a single morning to make. She was not alone in that adjustment. Across Canada and in the American states where Consumers Distributing had operated, the reaction to the closure announcement followed a familiar pattern. Former customers who had not set foot in a store in years felt a pull of unexpected loss. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that something which had been part of the landscape was about to be removed from it permanently. People who had written off the stores as outdated, who had quietly migrated to Walmart and Zellers without ever formally deciding to stop going to Consumers, found themselves remembering the catalog, remembering the order forms, remembering the specific satisfaction of carrying a box out to the car on a Saturday afternoon. Memory has a way of restoring what criticism had taken away. The liquidation process began quickly. Inventory that could be sold was marked down and moved through the stores in the weeks following the bankruptcy filing. The glass display cases that had defined the store layout for nearly 4 decades were emptied. The catalogs in those thick, glossy publications that had arrived in Canadian mailboxes twice a year since the late 1950s would not be printed again. The product numbers that generations of customers had carefully transcribed onto order forms meant nothing now. There was nothing left to order. The physical process of a retail liquidation is one of the bleaker human experiences that commerce produces. The shelves thinning out day by day, the signage going up, store closing, everything must go, in windows that had once displayed cheerful seasonal promotions. The regular customers coming in one last time, not entirely sure what they were looking for, moving through the familiar layout with the slow, slightly dazed quality of people attending a viewing. In some locations, the final days drew small crowds, not protesters, not mourners in any formal sense, just people who wanted to be there at the end of something they had known for a long time. A man in his 60s standing in the jewelry section where he had bought his wife's anniversary gift in 1974. A woman walking her teenage daughter through a store she had shopped in as a child herself, trying to describe what it had been like when it was full. The warehouse staff, who had spent their careers in the back rooms that customers never saw, packed and cleared, and eventually locked doors that would not open again under the consumer's distributing name. In the United States, the closure was quieter. The American stores had never achieved the same depth of cultural presence as the Canadian locations. They had been acquired rather than grown, operating for a shorter time, and with less of the accumulated familiarity that comes from decades in a community. The American closures were noted in local business sections and then largely forgotten. The story of consumers distributing was, at its heart, a Canadian story. What replaced the stores varied by location. Some buildings were absorbed by other retailers. Some sat empty for a period. The particular kind of emptiness that former retail spaces carry, too large for most uses, shaped by a commercial purpose that no longer exists. A few were demolished. Strip malls and big box anchors moved into the surrounding retail corridors, filling the commercial geography that consumers distributing had occupied with the formats that had helped accelerate its decline. The Toy City locations, which had already been closing through the early 1990s, were gone before the parent company filed. That chain's quiet disappearance had been a preview, a smaller version of the same story, playing out a few years earlier, noticed by fewer people. The workers who lost their jobs in 1996 did what displaced workers do. Some found positions with other retailers. Some left the industry entirely. The severance circumstances varied by location and by the specifics of what the bankruptcy proceedings allowed. For employees who had worked at the company for a decade or more, who had built their professional lives inside those stores, had organized their schedules around those shifts, had measured their working years by the arrival of new catalogs, the closure was not simply a job loss. It was the end of a context. The place where a significant portion of their adult life had happened no longer existed. That particular loss does not appear in bankruptcy filings. The American catalog showroom format, which had never been as culturally embedded in the United States as consumers distributing had been in Canada, was already declining broadly by the mid-1990s. Service merchandise and best products, the two chains that had most directly paralleled the consumer's distributing model in the American market, would both file for bankruptcy within a few years of the Canadian chain's collapse. The format itself was ending, not just the company. The warehouse behind the counter model that Jack Stupp had built in Toronto in 1957 had run its course across the entire continent. But the format's failure did not make the loss feel smaller to the people who had loved it. On the last operating day of the last consumers distributing store in Canada, there were no cameras, no ceremony, no official acknowledgement that something of 40 years' duration was ending. The final clerk who handed back the last order form, the final warehouse worker who carried the last box to the counter, the final customer who walked out through the door. None of them were recorded. None of them were quoted in the newspapers the next morning. It ended the way most things end, quietly, without the weight of the occasion matching the weight of what was being lost. The doors closed, the lights went off, and the catalog for the first time in nearly 4 decades did not come. When the stores closed, the customers went somewhere else. That is the most honest summary of what happened in the immediate aftermath of the consumers distributing bankruptcy. There was no period of collective mourning, no public campaign to save the chain, no serious attempt by any major retailer to acquire the brand and continue its operations. The customers who had been shopping at consumers distributing simply redistributed themselves across the retail landscape that had already been forming around them. Walmart, Zellers, The Bay, Future Shop for Electronics, specialty toy retailers for the Christmas catalog items that had once been circled in pencil on kitchen tables across the country. The transition was seamless in the way that only commerce can be seamless. Frictionless on the surface, with all of the loss happening underneath in the places that numbers do not measure. The buildings that had housed the stores did not transition as cleanly. Retail real estate carries the memory of what it used to be longer than people do. A former consumers distributing location in a mid-size Ontario city might sit partially vacant for a year before finding a new tenant. The glass display cases were removed. The counters were cleared. The particular layout of the space, designed around the specific operational logic of catalog fulfillment, was not easily repurposed. Some locations became dollar stores. Some became furniture outlets. Some were subdivided. A few were demolished and replaced with the kind of low-slung commercial construction that fills in the gaps of suburban retail corridors without anyone particularly noticing. None of them became anything that the people who had shopped there would have recognized as a replacement. The revival attempts came later, and they did not go well. In 2006, a decade after the bankruptcy, a former consumers distributing employee named Mark King relaunched the brand as an online retailer. The timing had a certain logic. If the catalog model was, as people had begun to say, internet shopping before the internet, then surely the internet itself was the natural home for a resurrection. The new consumers distributing website launched in the run-up to the 2012 holiday season, taking orders for furniture and brand name electronics. It shut down in January of 2013. King was subsequently accused of owing back wages to employees, and the company was issued a compliance order by Consumer Protection BC in 2015 for deceptive acts and practices and failing to issue refunds. The revival had lasted less than a year and had managed in that brief time to attach a new layer of disappointment to a name that had already carried enough of it. In 2023, an entrepreneur named Marco Riva acquired the rights to the consumers distributing name with considerably more ambitious plans. Stores of up to 300,000 square feet in major American cities, targeting the old department store real estate left behind by Sears and JCPenney and Macy's. The first locations were announced for San Francisco, New York, Chicago, and Miami. Whether those stores will open and whether the concept will find an audience in a retail environment shaped by Amazon and same-day delivery remains to be seen. The broader lesson that the industry drew from the consumers distributing collapse was not, in the end, a complicated one. The catalog showroom model failed in North America because it made a promise, the promise of the catalog, that it could not consistently keep. The out-of-stock problem was not a logistics failure or a technology failure. It was a trust failure. Every time a customer drove to the store and left empty-handed, the relationship between that customer and the company absorbed a small but permanent injury. Enough injuries, accumulated over enough years, across enough customers, and the relationship could not recover. The proof of this reading lies in what happened elsewhere. Argos, the British catalog retailer that was modeled directly on the consumers distributing format, is still operating today. It has adapted digital catalogs, same-day click and collect, a modernized fulfillment infrastructure, but the core concept of browsing a catalog and collecting a specific item remains intact. Argos solved the fulfillment problem. It invested in the back-end operations that made the front-end promise reliable. The customer who submits an order at an Argos location today expects their item to be there, and it is. That is the entire difference between a business that lasted and a business that didn't. What does it mean when a retail format survives on one side of the Atlantic and collapses on the other? Not because of the format itself, but because of the discipline required to execute it faithfully, year after year, without cutting corners in the warehouse while the catalog kept making promises at the front counter. The communities that had depended most heavily on consumers distributing felt the absence in ways that extended beyond the inconvenience of finding a new place to shop. In smaller cities and towns where the chain had been one of the more significant retail employers, the closure contributed to the gradual hollowing out of commercial districts that was already underway across much of mid-sized Canada. The jobs did not come back in equivalent form. The anchor presence that had drawn foot traffic to surrounding businesses was gone. What filled the space, when something filled it at all, did not fill it in the same way. The people who had worked there carried the experience forward into whatever came next. Some built careers in the retail industry that consumers distributing had trained them for, even if inadvertently. Others moved into entirely different fields, the decade or more they had spent behind those counters becoming a chapter in a longer story rather than the story itself. The catalog, which had been the heart of everything, was never printed again. Picture a winter evening somewhere in Canada. The year is 1978 or 1979 or somewhere in that quiet stretch of years when the world moved more slowly and the mail still mattered. The catalog arrived that afternoon. It came in the mailbox the way it always did. No fanfare, no special delivery, just there when someone went to check, thick and slightly heavy in the hand, the cover showing some arrangement of products against a clean background in the colors of the season. It smelled like fresh ink and coated paper. It had that specific weight that meant there was a lot inside, more pages than seemed necessary, more things than any one family could ever need, which was precisely the point. Someone carried it into the house and set it on the kitchen table, and then it began. The quiet ceremony that happened twice a year in households across the country, in apartments and bungalows and split levels, from one coast to the other. The catalog opened. Pages turned. A child settled at the corner of the table with full concentration and began the serious work of deciding. A mother stood at the counter with one eye on the stove and one hand turning pages, pausing at the kitchenware section, noting a price, folding the corner of a page back with a practiced motion. A pencil appeared. Small circles were drawn around product numbers. Outside, it was cold. Inside, for a little while, the catalog made the future feel specific and close and entirely possible. There were no chandeliers, no piped-in music carefully chosen to relax a shopper's resistance, no salespeople trained to redirect a customer towards something more expensive than what they came in for. The stores were utilitarian. Glass cases, paper forms, a counter, a door to the back. The experience was transactional in the most honest sense of the word. A customer came in wanting something specific, and the store's only job was to provide it. That honesty was not nothing. In a retail world built increasingly on spectacle and pressure, and the engineered erosion of a shopper's better judgment, consumers distributing offered something genuinely different. It offered respect, the respect of assuming that a customer had already thought about what they needed, had already done the work of choosing, and did not require assistance in wanting more than they had come for. For the families who depended on it most, working households managing careful budgets, young couples furnishing their first homes, parents trying to give their children something good at Christmas without spending money that wasn't there, that respect was felt. It was part of why the catalog was treated not as junk mail, but as a document worth keeping, worth returning to, worth passing across the table. The catalog made abundance feel democratic. It put the same products in front of a family in a small apartment in Hamilton that it put in front of a family in a house in the suburbs of Toronto. The price was the same. The product number was the same. The transaction, when it worked, was the same. For a country that has always been quietly conscious of the distance between what people have and what they want, the democratization was not a minor thing. And the people who made it work, the warehouse staff who walked those backroom shelves for years, who knew the inventory by feel, who took pride in getting it right, were never seen by the customers they served. They existed entirely behind the door, Their work was invisible by design, which meant their contribution was invisible too. They carried the whole operation on their backs and were thanked for it, when they were thanked at all, only indirectly, by the satisfied look on a customer's face as a box came across the counter. Those workers deserved more recognition than the format ever gave them. They still do. Somewhere tonight, someone is describing consumers distributing to a person who never knew it. They are trying to explain the catalog, the specific ritual of it, the pencil and the page, the product number written in careful handwriting on the order form. They are trying to explain the wait at the counter and why the wait felt different from other kinds of waiting. They are trying to explain what it meant when the box came out from the back and it was the right box, the right item, exactly what had been chosen weeks ago at the kitchen table on a winter evening. The person listening will not fully understand, not because the story is too complicated, but because some things only make sense from the inside, from having been there, from having held the catalog and felt for a moment that the right thing was within reach. Jack Stupp built that feeling in Toronto in 1957, from nothing, with a paper form in a warehouse and a belief that ordinary people deserved honest prices and a store that was on their side. For nearly 40 years, millions of people agreed with him. The catalog does not come anymore. The counters are gone. The warehouse doors are locked. But the memory of what it felt like to carry that box out to the car, to have chosen something, waited for it, and received exactly what was promised, that memory belongs to the people who lived it. And it does not require a product number to retrieve.